Somewhere in the highlands of Madagascar, there's a family right now saving money for something most people would never think to save for. Not a wedding, not a car, not a house. They're saving up to dig up their dead relative. And when the day finally comes, they won't cry, they won't wear black. They're going to pull the body out of the ground, wrap it in fresh silk, put it on their shoulders, and dance with it through the village, in front of everyone. No one screams, no one runs. The kids are laughing, someone's playing music. It looks less like a horror movie and more like a wedding that happens to involve a corpse. And here's the part that actually messes with your head. This isn't some forgotten ritual from 500 years ago that died out. This is happening right now, this year, in villages you could visit if you booked a flight this week. So the question isn't really, why do they do this? The real question is, what does a culture have to believe about death, about family, about time itself to make this feel completely normal? Stick around, because by the end of this video, the weirdest part of this story isn't even the dancing. It's something health officials are quietly terrified of, and something about the cloth these bodies are wrapped in that nobody talks about. This is Famadihana, often translated as the turning of the bones. It belongs to the Malagasy people of Madagascar, particularly the Marina and Betsileo highland communities. Every 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer, families reopen the family tomb, remove the wrapped remains of their ancestors, rewrap them in fresh cloth, and carry them above their heads in a joyful procession, complete with a live band, food, and dancing, before returning them to the crypt. Most videos about this stop right there. Bones, dancing. Wow, so different from Western funerals, roll credits. We're not doing that. We're going past the tourist explanation and into the details that even a lot of documentaries skip. The economics, the science, the politics, and the parts of this tradition that are genuinely, quietly disappearing. Let's start with something that's going to surprise you immediately. Here's the first thing almost nobody mentions. Famadihana, in the form we're talking about, is not some ritual stretching back into the deep, unknowable past of Madagascar. Historians and anthropologists believe the ceremony, as it's practiced today, likely only dates back to around the 17th century. In cultural terms, that's relatively recent, younger than the founding of Jamestown. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Madagascar sits off the coast of East Africa, but genetically and culturally, the Malagasy people trace much of their ancestry back across the Indian Ocean to Southeast Asia. Famadihana may actually be descended from older double funeral customs practiced by those same Austronesian seafaring cultures thousands of miles away. Which means somewhere out there might be a version of this tradition's ancestor still alive today, separated by an entire ocean. And that's not a coincidence. That's our next stop. On the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, the Torajan people practice something called manene, sometimes nicknamed the Walking Dead ritual. Families exhume mummified relatives, clean them, redress them in new clothes, and, in some accounts, even walk them between locations before returning them to their resting place. Sound familiar? Madagascar and Sulawesi are separated by more than 4,000 miles of open ocean. And yet two cultures, likely branches of the same ancient seafaring people, ended up preserving strikingly similar relationships with their dead, treating them not as gone, but as family members who still need to be dressed, informed, and included. That's not just a spooky coincidence for a YouTube video. That's actual anthropological evidence of a shared belief system that survived one of the most extreme migrations in human history. Now, let's talk about what it actually costs to keep that belief system alive. Quick question. In your family, what's the most expensive piece of property you own? For a lot of Malagasy families, the answer isn't the house, it's the tomb. Family crypts are often built with more money, more stone, and more craftsmanship than the houses the living actually sleep in. And that's not an accident or a flex. It reflects something deeper in the belief system. The dead aren't temporary, they're permanent residents. The ancestors, or Razana, are considered active, ongoing members of the family who continue to watch over and influence the living. So building them a better home than yourself isn't strange within that worldview. It's basically just respecting your elders permanently. But you don't just decide one random Tuesday to do a Famadihana. There's an entire specialist involved in picking the date, and it's a job title I guarantee you've never heard of. Families consult someone called a mpanandro, which roughly translates to maker of days. This person's entire role is to read the Malagasy astrological calendar and determine the most spiritually correct date to hold the ceremony. This isn't casual. Certain days are considered lucky, others are considered dangerous to disturb the dead on. The timing of the entire event, sometimes planned years in advance, hinges on this person's judgment. Imagine planning a family reunion, but the date isn't chosen by whoever has the least work conflicts. It's chosen by a spiritual timekeeper whose entire job is to read the calendar for cosmic permission. And once that date arrives and the bones come out, the old cloth that comes off them doesn't just get thrown in the trash. What happens to it next is one of the strangest details in this whole tradition. The remains are traditionally rewrapped in a fabric called lamba mena, often silk, sometimes brightly colored, sometimes even perfumed before it's wrapped around the bones. When the old cloth comes off during rewrapping, it isn't discarded like ordinary trash. In many cases, families keep it, cut it into pieces, and give it away. Because that scrap of fabric that once touched an ancestor's remains is believed to carry blessing, protection, even fertility. Think about that for a second. A fragment of burial cloth, treated the way some cultures treat a lucky charm or a piece of a saint's relic. It's a level of intimacy with death that most modern societies have spent the last century trying to sanitize completely out of existence. Which brings us to the part of this video that stops being quirky and starts being genuinely serious. Here's something almost never covered in the lighthearted, weird cultures content about Famadihana. Madagascar's health ministry has openly worried that this tradition may be helping spread one of the deadliest diseases in human history, plague. As in the actual bubonic and pneumonic plague, the same family of disease behind the Black Death. Madagascar experiences plague outbreaks nearly every year, and in 2017 the country faced an unusually severe outbreak that spread into pneumonic form, which can pass person to person through the air. Health officials have specifically flagged Famadihana as a risk, because if someone died of pneumonic plague, the bacteria can potentially still be present on their remains, and handling those bones years later during an exhumation can put people at risk of exposure. Because of this, Madagascar's Ministry of Public Health has recommended a mandatory 7-year gap before a plague victim's remains can be safely exhumed, and there are legal protocols requiring plague victims to be buried in sealed, non-reopenable tombs rather than traditional family crypts. But here's the twist that makes this a genuine cultural collision, not just a health footnote. Despite the warnings, there have been reported cases of families secretly digging up loved ones anyway, because for some families, honoring an ancestor properly matters more than the risk. That's not a weird fact. That's a real, ongoing tension between an ancient belief system and modern public health, happening in the same decade you're watching this video. Let's bring it back from the heavy stuff for a second, though, because there's a psychological theory about this ritual that's honestly kind of brilliant. Anthropologist Maurice Bloch spent years studying the Merina people and their relationship with Famadihana, and he proposed something that flips the joyful celebration narrative on its head. Bloch argued that the vigorous, almost rough handling of the remains, the carrying, the dancing, the movement, isn't just affectionate. It's symbolic. He suggested the ceremony represents the living, asserting a kind of triumphant power over death itself, a physical, energetic reclaiming of life in the face of decay. In other words, that joyful dancing you see in the footage? Some scholars think it's not in spite of death. It might be a ritualized act of defying it. That reframes everything, right? This isn't just a quirky funeral custom. It might be one of the most direct physical expressions of death does not get the final word that exists anywhere in human culture. Now, here's a fact that's almost funny in how specific it is. By law, Famadihana can only take place during Madagascar's dry season, roughly June through September. So this isn't a whenever the family feels like it event. It's legally restricted to a specific seasonal window tied to weather and road conditions in the highlands. Outside those months, it doesn't happen. Full stop. Which means right now, depending on when you're watching this, there's either a village mid-celebration or everyone's simply waiting. And that leads to the last point, the one that might actually matter most, because it's about whether any of this survives at all. Missionary influence over the last century gets mentioned a lot as a reason Famadihana is declining in some communities. Christian teachings in Madagascar have often discouraged the practice. But there's a quieter set of reasons that gets far less attention. Urban migration means younger generations increasingly live far from their ancestral tombs. The financial cost, cloth, feasts, musicians, travel for the whole extended family keeps rising. And even the reliability of that narrow dry season window is being affected by shifting weather patterns. So this isn't a tradition frozen in time for tourists to watch forever. It's a living, breathing cultural practice that's under real pressure in real time from forces most people watching this video have literally never thought to connect to a weird death ritual video, which means the version of Famadihana that exists today may not look the same in 50 years. You're not watching a museum piece. You're watching something that's still being decided. So when you put it all together, a ritual that might trace back across an ocean, a tomb more expensive than a house, a specialist whose whole job is picking sacred dates, cloth treated like a blessing, a genuine public health dilemma, a scholar who thinks the dancing is secretly a war against death itself, and a tradition that might not survive the century. That's not just a weird culture. That's one of the most complete windows into how a society thinks about death, family, and time that you'll find anywhere on Earth. And this is exactly the kind of thing I dig into on this channel. Not the surface level version everyone already knows, but the layer underneath it that actually makes you think. If this kept you watching till the end, that's exactly the kind of curiosity this channel is built around. Subscribe if you want more of these, because next time we're going somewhere even stranger.